They burst out laughing, calling it a flying milk jug, clumsy, awkward, never a match for the Bf-109. But when the skies over Europe roared with 2,000 horsepower, those laughs turned into screams of despair. The milk jug had become a flying tank, and it crushed the Luftwaffe. March 1943. Over the pale blue skies of northern France, twisting white trails streamed from propellers and engines, crossing and curling in the morning sun. Up there, war wasn't fought with cannons or the grinding of tank treads, but with the deafening roar of engines and bursts of gunfire tearing through clouds. Erich Brandt, just 20 years old, had graduated from the training school at Vernuchen less than a month earlier. His flight suit still carried the crisp scent of new cloth. The young man took to the front lines with enthusiasm, but also with the recklessness of youth and with the arrogance the Luftwaffe had carefully planted in the minds of its new pilots. That morning, his squadron was assigned to patrol the skies near Rouen. While waiting for takeoff, an older pilot, Kurt, 36, the one everyone in the squad jokingly called the Old Man, pointed toward the American planes parked across the airstrip where captured wrecks had been gathered the previous week. Among them sat the round-bodied, unusually broad-winged machines. "Look at this, Erich," Kurt laughed loudly. "They actually call this an airplane? A fighter. It's nothing more than a milk jug." The group of young pilots burst out laughing. Erich joined in, smiling with all the confidence in the world. He had seen the sleek British Spitfire, the compact Messerschmitt 109, the powerful Focke-Wulf 190. Compared to those, the American P-47 was a bad joke. In Erich's mind, today's dogfight would be nothing more than easy target practice. He imagined the clumsy Americans fumbling with their flying tin cans before tumbling into the French fields below. The thought gave him comfort, almost excitement. When the signal horn blared, he fired up the DB605 engine of his Bf-109G. The propeller slashed the air, the acrid smell of fuel mixed with oil smoke rising in his nostrils. Erich gripped the control stick, heart pounding. He had no idea the laughter from moments earlier would become a bitter memory haunting him for the rest of his life. Across the channel, at an airfield in northeastern France, Jack Reynolds zipped up his thick flight jacket, shivering yet sweating at the same time. He was only 23 from Ohio, and nothing more than a replacement pilot, a fill-in, really. To put it bluntly, he was here because the man he was replacing hadn't come back from a mission the week before. Before Jack stood the P-47 Thunderbolt, towering like a steel monster. Its bulk was so massive he felt like a child standing in front of his father's car for the first time. The Pratt & Whitney R2800, with its 18 cylinders, was already rumbling, its roar like an entire convoy of trucks revving their engines at once. Jack swallowed hard. He'd heard the P-47 was nicknamed the Jug because of its rounded, heavy shape. Seeing it up close now, he thought, that name couldn't be more accurate. The Thunderbolt seemed to be staring back at him like a giant bull snorting and pawing the ground, ready to charge headlong into battle. A tech sergeant ran up and slapped his shoulder. "Reynolds, you're filling in for Clark. Just keep the stick steady on takeoff. The Jug will handle the rest." Clark, the man Jack was replacing, had been killed 7 days earlier. The reminder hit him like a stone dropped on his chest. Jack only nodded, saying nothing, then climbed into the cockpit. As he pulled back on the stick, the Jug shuddered violently, pinning him against the seat. In an instant, the 8-ton beast lifted off the ground. Jack felt as if he were riding some iron creature out of myth. Half an hour later, the two formations, flying under two different flags, finally met in the sky. Erich led his Messerschmitts into a dive, spotting the dark, lumbering dots escorting the American B-17s. "There they are! We'll tear them apart in 5 minutes!" Erich shouted into the radio, his voice brimming with confidence. He dove, sunlight flashing off the silver wings. To his eyes, the P-47s were nothing but flying cattle, clumsy metal cows trudging along to protect the slow bombers. But only seconds later, a brutal truth slammed into him. One Thunderbolt suddenly broke from formation, banked hard, and dove with terrifying speed. The wind shrieked past Eric's headset like a knife blade. He had just enough time to see muzzle flashes from the Americans' guns before the Bf-19 next to him exploded, a fireball in the sky. "Dear God!" Eric screamed, his chest tightening. The slow milk jug was gone. In its place was a beast charging at him, spitting fire without mercy. And the man flying that beast was Jack. He squeezed the triggers, the vibration shaking the entire cockpit as the Brownings in his wings erupted all at once. The roar of gunfire mixed with the engine's thunder, rattling his whole body. In front of him, the Bf-109 spun out and burst into flames. Jack held his breath, unable to believe his eyes. This was the first time he had ever shot down an enemy. In that moment, his fear vanished, replaced by something else, a firm belief that this 8-ton monster really could save his life. "Oh God, I actually did it," he whispered, sweat pouring down his forehead while a wide grin spread across his face. The dogfight raged on. The sky turned into a giant furnace. Tracers lit up the air, engines screamed, black smoke curled and twisted. Eric tried to yank his Messerschmitt into a tight turn, working to slip behind another P-47. He aimed, squeezed the trigger. 20mm shells ripped forward, but the jug didn't go down. It only shuddered, its fuselage punched full of holes, then suddenly dove at a speed his 109 couldn't match. "Damn it!" Eric roared, a chill running down his spine. He realized his weakness. The Messerschmitt could climb well, but in a dive, the P-47 was king. Meanwhile, Jack on the other side was learning his first lesson. The jug wasn't built to turn tight like a Spitfire or a 109. It was a giant hammer, every strike heavy, brutal and crushing. When it came down, nothing could stand in its way. When the battle ended, Erich returned to base, his cockpit still trembling from nerves. He looked to either side. Half his squadron was gone. The mocking laughter of that morning had turned into a suffocating silence. In his mind, the image of the P-47 diving, fire pouring from 8 barrels, haunted him with a bone-deep terror. Across the lines, Jack landed back at a French airfield. His jug was riddled with bullet holes, but he was alive. Pulling off his flight helmet, he looked up at the grey sky and let out a breath. "Today, I survived." Thanks to the Jug One man began to doubt. Another had just found faith. The skies over Europe would never be the same. Early April 1943. The skies over northern France were warming, though the sunlight was still weak and pale, like a threadbare tablecloth. Erich Brandt sat in the wooden hut of his squadron, staring into a cup of black coffee without a thought in his head. The dogfight 2 weeks earlier still haunted him. He was not an easily frightened man. Since childhood, Erich had been taught that Luftwaffe pilots were the elite of Germany, the knights of the sky. He had sat for hours in training halls, listening to officers recount the victories of Galland, Mulders and Marseille. Yet the image of a P-47 diving down and blowing apart his comrade's plane with a short burst of gunfire was shaking that faith to its core. His comrades kept laughing it off. "It was just a slip-up, Brandt. One time doesn't prove anything. Next time we meet, those tin cans will drop like overripe plums." But when night came, Erich woke drenched in sweat from nightmares of the Thunderbolt's terrifying roar. The next day, the squadron was ordered to intercept a formation of B-17s pushing deeper into German-held territory. Erich climbed into his Bf-109G. The DB-605 engine roared to life with its crisp staccato bursts, but this time, to Erich, it felt weak. Steadying himself, he took a deep breath and muttered, Today, I'll prove the Messerschmitt is still king of the skies. The B-17s appeared, a steel wall in the air. Erich dove with his squadron, ready to unleash his 20mm cannons. But from both flanks, massive, dark shapes slid into view. P-47 Thunderbolts. They no longer flew clumsy and slow as he had once imagined, but moved in disciplined groups of 4 like machines. Erich squeezed the trigger. Shells streaked forward. A B-17 belched smoke. But before he could savour it, a P-47 dove out of the sun, dropping like a sledgehammer. Gunfire exploded all around him. Metal fragments whistled past his canopy. He yanked the stick hard left, sweat pouring inside his gloves. The Messerschmitt was nimble and light, but in a dive, the P-47 was blisteringly fast, almost untouchable. When he finally slipped out of the crosshairs, Erich gasped for breath. The realization hit him like ice water. They've figured out how to use the jug, and when it dives, no one can match it. At a forward airstrip near Reims, Jack Reynolds was relearning lessons no training manual had ever taught. When he first arrived, he thought the jug was a lumbering brute, but the recent dogfights had given him a new perspective on the giant bird of steel. Veteran officers called the P-47's fighting style boom and zoom, dive to attack, then throttle up and break away. Simple but devastatingly effective. That morning, Jack and the 362nd Squadron took off to escort a formation of B-17s heading into the Ruhr. The sky was a deep blue, not a cloud in sight. From a distance, he could already see the black dots racing toward them, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. "Reynolds, hold altitude, wait for the signal," the squadron leader's voice barked over the radio. Jack gripped the stick tight, his heart pounding. The enemy was in range. "Dive! Dive! Hit them now!" He yanked the stick forward and the jug plunged like a stone in free fall. Jack's body was slammed against the seat. Below, a Bf-109 was lining up to attack the B-17 formation. Jack squeezed the trigger. The Brownings roared, tracers slashed through the air, smashing into the German fighter. The 109 jolted violently, its wing snapped back, then the whole plane erupted in a ball of orange flame. Jack pulled hard, the jug screaming as it tore upward, out of range of enemy fire. He bit his lip, salty sweat on his tongue, but his chest swelled with pride. The jug was no longer some clumsy milk jug. It was an iron hammer in the sky. On the other side, Erich was twisting his Messerschmitt in desperate circles, trying to shake pursuit. He saw his comrades falling, burning one after another. Within minutes, the sky had turned into hell. Erich shouted into the radio, but few voices answered back. Elsewhere, Jack burst through a cloud of smoke and spotted a lone Bf-109 below. He dove. In that instant, fate put him and Erich on the same flight path. Erich glanced in his rearview mirror and saw the jug streaking toward him. Terror surged through him. He jerked left, but the jug stayed on him. Bullets hissed past his canopy. He muttered a prayer, forcing his 109 toward a cloud bank. Jack locked the target in his gun sight. All it would take was one more pull of the trigger. But at that moment, the squadron leader's voice thundered in his ears. "Reynolds, break off!" "Mission accomplished. We've been ordered to return." Jack ground his teeth, pulled the jug up, and left the shot behind. In the blink of an eye, Erich escaped death. He dove straight into the clouds, his heart hammering as if it would burst from his chest. Back at base, Erich tore off his flight helmet, his hands trembling. He had survived, but the price was more than half his squadron gone. Friends he had flown with were gone forever. A milk jug, number, it was a grim reaper. On the other side, Jack touched down on the runway, his jug intact this time. He climbed out, his legs shaky, but his lips pressed into a thin, relieved smile. He had survived, and the jug had proven that when used the right way, it could crush any enemy. That night, Erich lay awake in his hut, eyes wide open. He remembered his own mocking laughter just 2 weeks before, remembered his comrades falling like dry leaves. He clenched his fists, bitterness filling his chest. Meanwhile, in the barracks, Jack opened his journal. His rough handwriting sprawled across the page. Today, I flew the jug again. Turns out, it's deadly. It's a shield, it's a hammer, and maybe it's the only chance we have of making it home. From that day forward, the skies over Europe were no longer a place where the Luftwaffe could laugh. The engines droned, fading, then swelling again, sometimes low and heavy, sometimes shrieking, like a predator stalking its prey. Erich Brandt sat on the edge of a trench, carbine resting across his knees, eyes fixed on the grey sky. His squadron had been torn to pieces, reduced to just a handful of wrecked aircraft. Orders from above forced him to temporarily join an infantry unit. He was used to fighting among the clouds. Now he and his comrades moved by truck and horse-drawn wagons, dragging along a few outdated guns. They knew they were little more than easy prey. That afternoon, as the column crossed a wide open field, an older soldier muttered, "Watch out for the jug pack." Erich frowned. The jug pack? The man gave a dry, nervous laugh. Yeah, they're like steel wolves, silent until they strike. The words had barely left his lips when the sky split open. The thunder of Pratt and Whitney R280s shook the air. The steel wolves appeared, olive-painted P-47s, their silver wings glinting harshly in the sun. A chill ran through Erich. He had sat in a cockpit before, had faced them in the air, but on the ground it was worse. He felt like a rabbit caught in the open, watching hawks dive with no place to hide. The first jug plunged. Fire spat from its guns. The dirt road erupted as if ploughed by explosives. Trucks flipped, soldiers were hurled like rag dolls. A piercing shriek cut the air as a 500-pound bomb dropped, earth and rock heaving up like a breaking wave. Erich dove into a bomb crater, clutching his head, ears ringing. The stench of gunpowder and burned flesh seeped into the air. When he looked up, the convoy was gone, just smoking carcasses of twisted steel mingled with charred bodies. High above, Jack Reynolds rolled with his dive, eyes fixed on the prey below. Wind tore past his ears. The cockpit shuddered. He lined up a slow-moving truck in his sights and squeezed the trigger. The wing guns erupted, tongues of fire raking downward. The truck exploded in flames. Jack pulled the jug up, climbing out, leaving behind a rising tower of black smoke. Jack didn't cheer like some of his squad mates. Instead, his chest tightened. For the first time, he felt the full imbalance of it all. They were up here, the enemy trapped down there. This wasn't a fair fight anymore. This was a hunt. Circling back, he looked down. The convoy below bunched together, trying to escape the inferno. Over the radio came the squadron leader's voice. "Make another pass, boys. Those trucks are packed with ammunition." Jack bit his lip, rolled the jug over and dove again. In his sights, he clearly saw the face of a young German soldier, turned up to the sky, eyes wide open. In that instant, Jack understood exactly what the boy was seeing. A massive jug, plummeting like a monster out of hell. He squeezed the trigger. Gunfire shredded the convoy. Ammunition crates erupted, shrapnel flying high with the screams of German soldiers. Jack pulled up, the jug climbing again, but his stomach knotted. He felt as if he had just opened fire on a herd of defenceless animals. On the ground, Erich crawled from his crater, his face smeared with mud and blood. He looked up just as a jug skimmed low, close enough for him to see the flash of silver on its wingtip. Gunfire ripped past, tearing up the earth in front of him. Had he moved a second slower, his body would have been shredded. He screamed in despair. Around him, comrades died without even crying out. One man was thrown into the air, landing beside him, eyes still wide open. Meanwhile, Jack climbed back to a safe altitude, his heart still clenched. Over the radio came his squad mates' jubilant shouts. "The enemy convoy's been wiped out." "Great work, boys." He forced himself to answer, "Roger that." But his voice came out hoarse. The image wouldn't leave him. The wide eyes of that young German, the convoy torn apart. The attack had lasted only 10 minutes, but its echoes would linger forever. Erich sat silently in the crater, his hands trembling. The sky was quiet again, leaving only black smoke and the stench of charred flesh. He thought of the Luftwaffe's glory, days in 1940, when he himself had admired German pilots as gods. Now that myth was ripped apart without mercy, replaced by the roar of American jugs. At base, Jack landed. His P-47 bore a few flak scars, but it was intact. As he climbed down, a mechanic grinned. "Quite a hunt, wasn't it, Reynolds?" Jack just nodded, saying nothing. Deep down, he felt no joy at all. Night fell. Erich sat in the makeshift hut of a field hospital, an oil lamp flickering beside him. He scribbled hastily into his notebook. "Once we called the P-47 a milk jug. Today it is a giant predator. We are no longer pilots, we are only prey." Across the channel, Jack also opened his small journal and wrote a few short lines. "The jug isn't just an airplane. It turns me into a hunter. But when I look straight into the eyes of the prey, I'm no longer sure I want to pull the trigger." Two men, two fates, yet they shared the same feeling, fear and the torment of conscience, as the P-47 Thunderbolt officially transformed from a laughingstock into a killer on the ground. March 1945. The Rhine River, its murky waters twisting like an ancient scar dividing East and West Germany. Erich Brandt stood on the bank, eyes locked on the current. Behind him loomed an 88mm flak gun, its crew tense and waiting. He knew the importance of this place. The Rhine was the final natural fortress. For 150 years, no foreign army had crossed it. If the Allies forced their way over here, Germany would lose everything. Erich tightened the strap of his helmet, trying to steady himself. He was no longer in the cockpit of a Messerschmitt. Fuel was scarce, the surviving planes battered and few, rarer now than gold. The Luftwaffe was no longer an air force, only the shadow of its former glory. But he had still been sent here, not as a pilot, but as a liaison officer, a small cog in the crumbling defensive machine. Then he heard it, the sound that had haunted him for months, the roar of the Pratt and Whitney engines, deep and heavy like funeral drums from the sky. The air above the Rhine trembled. Erich looked up. Dozens of black specks swelled larger, flying in disciplined groups of 4. Morning sunlight flashed off their silver wings. "They're here," he muttered. No longer a joke, no longer a milk jug. They were a pack of steel beasts charging in to clear the way for the tanks behind. The 80s thundered, gunners shouting over the din. The jugs dove like divine lances. Flak bursts blossomed in the clouds, but nothing turned them aside. They opened fire, tearing the riverbank to shreds, smashing gun emplacements into rubble. Erich shouted himself hoarse, "Take cover! Get down!" He dove into a dugout. Overhead, the P-47s poured down a cold rain of bullets. The earth shook, the bunker swayed as if it would collapse. The Rhine defence line, the last pride of the Third Reich, was being shredded apart by the flying tanks he once mocked. Inside a sweltering cockpit, Jack Reynolds gripped his control stick tight. His squadron had orders to cover Patton's Third Army. Their mission was clear: wipe out the flak, destroy German defences, and open the way for the American armour to cross the river. The sky was bright, but Jack's chest felt heavy as stone. He knew this wasn't just another mission. The Rhine was more than a river. It was a symbol, the wall that had stopped generations. Today, he and his Jug had to turn it into a doorway to peace. "All wings, prepare to dive," the squadron leader's voice cut through the radio. Jack drew a deep breath, pushed the Jug forward and dropped. Wind whipped against the canopy. The fuselage shuddered. Below, he could see the 80s aiming skyward, German crews crouched in their pits. He squeezed the trigger. The wing guns spat, white streaks ripping across the ground. 188 exploded, bodies flung aside. The Jug roared low over the earth, then soared up like a hawk. On the radio, his squad mates cheered, "Target destroyed! Hit them again!" Jack rolled back, dove once more. This time he loosed a 500-pounder on the bridgehead. The blast shook the riverbank, black smoke curling skyward. Pulling up, he saw the American Shermans on the west bank beginning to surge forward, preparing to cross. His heart pounded. He realized the 8-ton beast he had once doubted was now the giant's hand, building a bridge for an entire army to cross the Rhine. In the bunker, Erich was thrown back by the force of the blast. His ears rang, dust coated his face. Crawling outside, he lifted his head just in time to see wave after wave of Jugs diving like a storm of iron. Across the river, he saw the American Shermans creeping onto the crossing. Overhead, P-47s circled, wiping out every nest of resistance. A German machine gun had barely opened fire before Jug tracers cut it down. Erich felt as if he were witnessing a massive execution ritual, with Germany as the victim and the Jug as the executioner. Above, Jack saw the same scene, but from the other side. The columns of Shermans crawled forward like herds of steel elephants. Suddenly, he understood why the generals called the P-47 a flying tank. It didn't just fight, it led the way, it opened the road. The crossing began. That night, under the cover of darkness, thousands of American troops slipped across on boats and rafts. The P-47s circled overhead like steel phantoms, their thunder drowning out all other sounds as they poured gunfire into every flicker of light on the eastern bank. From his dugout, Erich strained his eyes toward the river. He knew it was all over, no Luftwaffe, no chance. Only the endless pack of Jugs, each dive another nail hammered into Germany's coffin. Meanwhile, Jack guided his Jug in wide circles above the river, watching the torchlight flicker along the water. The army was crossing, each step shielded by the winged giant. He whispered into his oxygen mask, "We're writing history tonight. God help us, if only it could cost less blood." By dawn, Patton was standing on the eastern bank. The Rhine, the fortress wall no one had ever breached, was now torn wide open. Erich sat numbly on a mound of dirt, his eyes vacant as he watched German prisoners being herded together. Jack, meanwhile, landed his aircraft. His plane leaked oil, its fuselage riddled with holes, but it was still intact. Running a hand across the battered skin of the Jug, he murmured softly, "Well done, old friend. Today you built the bridge to peace. War is like a sudden downpour. It comes, sweeps everything away, then is gone." For the Luftwaffe, April 16th, 1945, was exactly that. Erich Brandt awoke in a rickety wooden hut on the outskirts of Leipzig, where what remained of his squadron was holed up. Outside, the air stank of fuel, mingled with the thick smoke rising from bombed-out factories. News spread fast. American, British, and even Soviet forces were closing in. But what terrified everyone was not the infantry or the tanks, it was word of a massive air raid about to descend. An older squadron leader leaned close and whispered to Erich, "They're going to wipe out every airfield. By sunrise, the sky over Germany will be hell itself." The sun had barely risen when it began. Erich rushed outside, craning his neck, and his heart seemed to stop. In the western sky, hundreds, then thousands of black dots streamed in long lines. The lead formations were P-47s, followed by Spitfires, Mustangs, Typhoons, all pouring in like a flood of steel. Morning light gleamed off their wings, turning the sky into a blinding mirror. Air raid sirens wailed non-stop. A voice screamed over the loudspeakers, "We are under attack! Take cover! Hurry!" Erich ran toward the flak gun, but before he could reach it, the roaring began. Jugs dove so low he could see the painted numbers on their sides. Explosions ripped the ground apart, hangars burst into flames. Within minutes, dozens of Bf-19s and Fw-19s, grounded and helpless, became blazing torches. Erich froze. The Luftwaffe, the force he had once admired, once been proud of, was being annihilated before his very eyes. High above, Jack Reynolds clenched the control stick. Today, his squadron was part of something immense, 6,000 Allied aircraft attacking at once. The goal was to wipe out every last trace of the Luftwaffe, to cut off Germany's wings. All squadrons, listen up, targets ahead, hit the hangars and fuel depots, keep it low and steady. Jack nodded, though no one could see. He rolled the jug, dropping low. Germany's soil stretched beneath him, airfields scarred across the land like open wounds. He pressed the trigger. The Brownings barked again, bullets tearing through a hangar. An Fw-190 caught fire and exploded on the runway. A 500-pound bomb dropped from his wing, struck the fuel depot and detonated. The blast hurled flames skyward, higher than the steeple of the nearby church. "Good shooting, Reynolds," his squadron leader shouted in triumph. Jack pulled the jug back up, but his heart grew heavier. He had seen German soldiers running from a hangar, only to throw up their hands in a futile gesture before the fire swallowed them whole. Erich stumbled out of a trench, coughing through the smoke. Around him was chaos, flames, gunfire, choking clouds, men screaming. A flight of jugs dove so low he could make out the blur of the pilot behind the glass. To Erich, it was the cold stare of death itself. Gunfire ripped the ground, earth and stone spraying. His friend Karl crumpled beside him without a sound. Erich screamed, but his cry was drowned in the storm of engines. He collapsed, clawing at the wet earth. In that moment, he realized the bitter truth. The Luftwaffe was no longer a fighting force. They were nothing but targets, waiting to be wiped from existence. All around him, Jack felt the sky tremble. The P-47s dove, one after another, then pulled up, only to dive again, the sound like a symphony of destruction. He banked over a second airfield. Below, rows of Messerschmitts sat wingtip to wingtip. He dropped his bomb. A pillar of fire shot upward. Smoke and shards of steel slammed against the jug's wings. Over the radio, someone laughed harshly. "We're wiping them out." The Luftwaffe's finished. Jack didn't laugh. To him, it looked more like a mass execution than a battle. Each dive wasn't a fight, it was a knife stroke against an enemy already bound. That afternoon, the slaughter went on. Each time a jug pulled away, the smoke hadn't even cleared before the next wave dove down. Erich cowered in a bunker, hands clamped over his ears. When the engines faded for a moment, he lifted his head, and what he saw horrified him. The entire airfield was nothing but ash. Nearly 300 aircraft burned to the ground. All that remained were twisted frames, charred tyres, shattered wings. He collapsed, tears mixing with the dust. Not from fear of death, but from watching the proud soul of the Luftwaffe vanish. High above, Jack turned his head. From dozens of airfields, black smoke rose in towering columns, as if all of Germany were engulfed in one great funeral. He knew this was the end for the enemy, yet he felt no relief. By dusk, the last P-47 pulled away, leaving behind a silence so grim it rang in the ears. Erich sat in the ruins, listening to the wind whistle through burned-out fuselages. A black crow landed on the charred corpse of a comrade, cawing hoarsely. This was the end. The Luftwaffe, the symbol that had once made all of Europe tremble, had died this very day. Jack landed back at base. As he climbed down, the ground crew cheered. "You made it back, Reynolds!" He nodded, saying nothing. In his mind still echoed the blasts, the screams, and the stares of Germans as the Jug bore down. April 16th, 1945 went into history as the Luftwaffe's darkest day. 24 airfields wiped off the map, nearly 300 German planes destroyed, hundreds of pilots and mechanics killed in flames. Erich had nothing left but the memory of the roar and the fire that devoured his friends. Jack had nothing left but a gnawing exhaustion. He had survived, but he carried the invisible scar of being a witness to the apocalypse from the sky. Late April, 1945. German forces were collapsing. Columns of soldiers and civilians clogged the rural roads. Old trucks, horse-drawn carts, even bicycles overloaded with baggage, strung together like lines of ants fleeing. Erich Brandt trudged along with a group of battered troops, carbines slung across his back. His boots were in tatters, caked in mud. He was no longer a pilot. There were no planes left to fly. He was only another shadow among the chaos of history. Then the sound came. At first, a faint rumble, then louder, louder, until the ground shook. Someone screamed, "Aircraft! Jugs!" Erich looked up. Against the clear blue sky, a formation of P-47s appeared. They dropped lower, sunlight flashing off silver wings. To Erich, they were no longer airplanes. They were giant iron beasts, ploughing the earth into furrows of blood. The first Jug dove, its guns spitting fire. Bullets ripped the road apart. A truck burst into flames, a blazing torch. Horses shrieked, reared, then collapsed, torn to pieces. The column panicked, scattering into the woods. The Jug swung around, skimmed low, and dove again. Gunfire swept across human figures as if a plough were cutting a wheat field. Erich hurled himself into a ditch, face pressed into the mud. His heart hammered wildly. Each time the roar swept over, the earth beneath him shook like thunder. Above, Jack Reynolds rolled the Jug, eyes fixed on the dirt road below. Intelligence had been clear. Anything moving was a target. Make sure the enemy can't regroup. Jack swallowed hard. He saw the ragged convoy, trucks, horse-drawn wagons, people on foot. His squadron leader's voice crackled through the radio. "Red flight, they've got flak down there. Take it out now." He shoved the Jug into a dive. In his gun sight appeared a horse cart loaded with wooden crates. He squeezed the trigger. Bullets ripped the earth. The crates erupted. It was ammunition. A fireball exploded, hurling horses and men into the air. As the Jug screamed past, Jack glimpsed blackened figures rolling along the road. He yanked the Jug upward, stomach twisting. Over the radio came the laughter of his squad mates. "Right on target, Reynolds. Dead centre in the column." Jack stayed silent. In his mind replayed the image of the horse leaping in flames, like a puppet set on fire. On the ground, Erich crawled out of the ditch, eyes stinging. The road before him had turned into a strip of bloody earth. Wrecked horse carts, dead soldiers, black smoke billowing. He heard groans, cries for mothers, the frantic stampede of fleeing footsteps. Another Jug dove, raking the head of the convoy with gunfire. A wooden bridge splintered apart, men and wagons plunging into the stream below. Erich shook, clutching his chest, and cried out, "They're ploughing all of Germany, turning every road into a graveyard." High above, Jack looked down. His squadrons split up their attacks, some strafed trains, some bombed bridges, others tore into convoys. All of Germany was now nothing more than ground being ploughed into pieces. That afternoon, Erich stumbled into the woods, panting. He didn't know how he was still alive. In his notebook he scrawled, "We can't fight anymore. All we can do is run. No place is safe. No one escapes." At a French base, Jack landed. The ground crew cheered when they saw his jug intact, but Jack only nodded. That night his hand shook as he wrote in his journal, "Today I turned the road into a ploughed field." But instead of crops, what grew was fire, smoke, and corpses. Are we still soldiers, or just farmers for death? The days that followed brought the same scenes everywhere. Trains exploding, bridges collapsing, convoys burning. Every jug's dive carved another furrow into Germany, each one leaving a longer trail of blood. Eric grew weaker by the day. He avoided all roads, skirting only through woods. But the jug's roar came anywhere, any time. He lived like an animal being hunted, waiting for the moment of the kill. Jack grew harder, more numb. He followed orders, dove, fired, climbed back up. But every night, when he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of those below, their eyes wide open as his plane came screaming down. April drew to a close. Germany was now nothing but a field of fire and smoke. Eric sat by a small fire in the woods, whispering, "We have lost." Germany's pride is gone. Jack, in his barracks, closed his journal and murmured to himself, "The jugs have done what no army ever could, crushed an entire nation, road by road, bridge by bridge, wheel by wheel." April 1945. Germany's soil trembled under bombs, while above, the giant shadows of P-47s still loomed. For German soldiers, every time they heard the Pratt and Whitney roar, they knew death was coming. But what few below understood, even the American pilots in the jugs lived beneath that same shadow of death. Jack Reynolds once joked with his squadmates, "We'll be lucky if we live through 2 missions." A smile tinged with irony, but deep down he knew death would find him one day, unless the P-47s kept him alive. Eric Brandt by now was only a shadow of himself. He and a handful of stragglers dug in near Magdeburg. Food was gone, ammunition nearly so. That day, as they dug trenches in a field, the sky roared again. A squadron of P-47s appeared, diving like starved vultures. Eric dove into a shelter just as a burst of fire swept past, flinging dirt and stone. The soldier beside him, Otto, collapsed, blood pouring down the trench wall. Eric fell to his knees, shaking his friend, but Otto's eyes were wide open and lifeless. He screamed until his voice broke. "Damn it! We have nothing left. Why won't you let us be?" To Erich, death was no longer an abstract image. It had a clear shape, silver wings slicing across the sun, leaving a black shadow that smothered everything. At that same moment, Jack was above, guiding his jug into a small town. He was used to the scene by now, bombs falling, houses collapsing, smoke and fire rising. But that day, tragedy struck his own squadron. "Number 3, you're on fire," the radio blared. Jack snapped his head around. Jimmy Clark's jug, his closest friend in the unit, was streaming thick black smoke. From the belly of the plane, fuel poured in flames. "Bail out, Jimmy, now!" Jack shouted. But no answer came. Jack watched as the jug wobbled, then nosed straight into a field. A fireball erupted, black smoke curling high into the sky. The squadron fell silent. Jack bit his lip until it bled. He had just lost his best friend in a heartbeat. In the trench below, Eric listened as the jug engines faded into the distance. He looked around. Only 3 men in his squad were still alive. Red soil, the stench of burned flesh, choking smoke. He asked himself why death had spared him, only to take Otto. On the other side, Jack landed back at base. His squad mates rushed out, clapping his shoulder, cheering that he had made it back alive. But then he broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Death didn't care about sides. Today it had taken Jimmy, tomorrow it could just as easily be him. That night, under the weak flicker of a kerosene lamp, Erich wrote in his notebook, "I no longer believe in victory. I only believe in death. Every time the jug's shadow passes overhead, I see my name already written on it." Meanwhile, in the American barracks, Jack listened to the laboured breathing of another pilot who had barely survived a crash landing. The man's mind, however, had shattered. He sat motionless for a long time, then suddenly drew his sidearm and fired into the empty cockpit of a grounded plane, screaming, "Never again! I'll never fly again!" Men rushed to restrain him. Jack watched, shivering. Death didn't just take lives. It tormented the living with memories, with ghosts that never let go. The next day, Jack's squadron took off again. Jimmy's place beside him was empty, and that emptiness was a blade lodged deep in his chest. As he dove on a German convoy, Jack followed orders, pressed the trigger, dropped the bombs, but his mind was filled with faces of those who would never return. He thought of Jimmy, of the pilots already gone. He felt the shadow of death etched into every cockpit. Meanwhile, Eric, retreating down a country road, looked up and saw the jugs come again. This time, he didn't run. He stood still, face lifted to the sky. In that moment, he accepted that the shadow would eventually swallow him. But the jug roared past, its fire missing. He was still alive. And then Eric realized the cruel truth. Survival was its own punishment. Each day alive meant watching more and more of his comrades die. That night, Eric sat by the ashes of a burned-out fire, clutching his head, whispering, "I no longer fear death. I only fear this war will never end." And Jack, in his journal, wrote, "We are so close to victory, but every time I glance at the empty cockpit beside me, I ask why men must kill each other at all." The shadow of death hovered over Europe, indifferent to uniforms or flags. It only waited for the moment to turn everything into ash. From the first days of the war, the Germans built terrifying icons. The Tiger Eye, an iron beast with over 100 millimeters of armor and an 88 millimeter cannon that could pierce a Sherman from more than 1,500 meters. American soldiers called it the Grey Nightmare. The Panzerwaffe, the armoured force that crushed Poland and France in mere weeks. The Luftwaffe, the wings of the Third Reich, once filling Europe's skies with dread. The German people were raised to believe these things were invincible. But by spring 1945, as smoke covered their homeland, these legends were the first to shatter. And the one that broke them was a machine once ridiculed as a joke, the P-47 Jug. Eric Brandt crouched in a foxhole near Hanover. The night before, his unit had been ordered to guard the last surviving panzer column, just a few Tigers and Panzer IV gathered into a final defensive line. He remembered clearly his days in flight school, when training manuals described the Tiger as a mobile fortress, unbreakable. Propaganda photos showed Tigers crushing Shermans like toys. Young soldiers like him believed it without question. As long as Tigers remained, Germany would never fall. That morning, as the sun rose, Eric saw the Tigers looming before him. Their massive turrets turned slowly, the long 88 millimeter barrels aimed at the horizon. Despite exhaustion, despite despair, a spark of pride flickered inside him. At least we still have these beasts. But then came the sound. That familiar roar of Pratt and Whitney's, heavy and deep, like funeral drums rolling across the sky. Erich lifted his head. The Jugs appeared in tight four-plane formations, sunlight flashing off their silver wings. They didn't circle. They didn't hesitate. They dove straight in. "Fire! Quickly! Fire now!" an officer screamed. The 88 millimeter beside Erich thundered, flak bursting overhead. But the Jugs never wavered. The first bomb struck a Tiger square on its turret roof. The explosion split the sky. The entire turret was torn off, hurled dozens of meters away. Flames burst from the hatches, swallowing the crew inside. Their screams were choked off in smoke. Eric's mouth hung open. The invincible monster had lasted only seconds against a Jug. Shaking, he thought, the Tiger, our legend, is nothing more than a steel coffin before the jug. High above, Jack Reynolds banked his jug, eyes locked on the gun sight. Below, a tiger loomed, its thick armour plates gleaming in the sun. He had heard all the stories about the tiger, Shermans firing a dozen rounds without penetrating, American soldiers breaking and running at the mere rumour of its presence. But from up here, Jack saw only slow-moving hulks of steel. He released a 500-pound bomb. It dropped straight down and detonated beside a Panzer IV. The explosion flipped the tank onto its side, the crew inside never having a chance. Jack pulled the jug back up, heart pounding. For a fleeting moment, he felt a grim satisfaction. Tigers, panzers, the very things that had haunted American troops, were burning before his eyes. But then he froze as he saw a German tanker leap from a stricken vehicle, his body ablaze, writhing like a torch before collapsing lifeless. Jack clenched his teeth, fingers tightening on the stick. Inside him, pride and anguish twisted together. The earth shook again and again. Jugs screamed down in endless dives. Rockets streaked, bombs shrieked, 50 caliber tracers raked the ground. Eric huddled in a pit, clutching his helmet. He heard the blasts, the screech of tearing metal, the screams of men. When he finally lifted his head, the sight froze him. A column of Panzer IVs burned furiously, treads blown apart, black smoke rising skyward. Across the field, the last surviving Tiger lay cracked open, its turret split wide. Tankers stumbled out, their bodies aflame, rolling on the ground in vain. Their screams carried, unending, through the smoke. Erich bit his lip until it bled. The last sliver of belief inside him snapped. The Panzerwaffe, the armoured force that once conquered a continent, was now nothing but heaps of twisted iron. Meanwhile, high above, Jack thought back to his early days in Europe, when every American pilot whispered about the Tiger, when men called the Panther a killer machine. Now he was witnessing the truth in reverse, the jug turning legends into target practice. That night, Jack wrote in his journal, "Today I saw a tiger go up like a matchbox. Everything the enemy once claimed was invincible is now ash. I should feel joy, but I only feel heavy, because I know war leaves losses no victory can replace." That same afternoon, Erich and a handful of stragglers pulled back toward a wooden bridge. Soldiers crowded together, trying to cross the river. It was the last glimmer of hope to escape the advancing Americans. But the jugs came again. Rockets screamed, and the bridge shattered. Its timbers plunged into the rushing water below, dragging men, wagons, and horses down with them. The cries echoed, then were swallowed by the current. Erich stood frozen, tears spilling down his cheeks. He no longer ran. He knew there were no legends left to protect them. No tigers, no Luftwaffe, no Germany of old. Only fire and the American planes howling above. Up above, Jack was one of the pilots who had just fired the rockets. He saw the bridge collapse, saw dark figures tumbling into the river. As he pulled the jug up, his throat tightened. This wasn't victory. It was apocalypse. That night, Erich sat beside the ashes, writing in his battered notebook, "Tiger, Panzer, Luftwaffe, all of them died in the jug's fire. Our legends are nothing but black smoke and twisted steel. We once laughed at it, called it a milk jug, but now that jug has swallowed every legend whole April 1945. The skies over Germany suddenly felt strange, no roar of Pratt and Whitneys, no jug dives, no flak guns cracking. After days of earth-shaking fury, the morning was silent. Only the spring wind stirred across blackened fields where burned-out tanks lay hollow, bridges splintered, and roads torn to rubble. Erich Brandt stepped from his dugout, dazed, like a man waking from a nightmare. He lifted his eyes to the blue sky, but instead of packs of jugs screaming down, he saw only a few thin clouds. For a moment, he couldn't believe it. He had lived with apocalypse so long that silence itself had become terrifying. The road ahead of him was no longer a road. It was a strip of blood-red earth littered with wrecked vehicles, broken timbers, and the charred carcasses of horses. Survivors wandered like ghosts, their eyes empty. Erich dragged himself along with the stream of people. They were no longer soldiers, no longer under command, just a desperate crowd of old men, boys, and even civilians mixed among them. He stopped before the burned-out hull of a Tiger. Its turret lay thrown yards away, its hull scorched black. From inside came the sickening stench of roasted flesh. Erich turned away, retching. Once it had been pride, now it was nothing but a steel grave. He whispered as if to himself, "No more legends, only ashes." All of Germany was now one vast cemetery, and Erich realized he was no longer fighting for anyone, nor protecting anything. He was only a chance survivor stumbling through the wreckage. On the other side, at an American forward base in France, Jack Reynolds sat on a wooden crate, his tired eyes fixed on the jug before him. Its skin was riddled with bullet holes, paint peeled away, oil streaking down its flanks. But it was still there. It had still brought him home. Last night, Jack had landed in silence. No cheers, no joking calls of good hunting like in the early days. His squadron was down to half strength. Every time he looked at the empty spaces in the formation, his heart turned cold. Jack ran his hand gently across the jug's battered metal skin and whispered, "My brothers are gone. It's just you and me now." Inside the camp, his comrades sat like statues. No stories, no laughter, only silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of exhaustion, of souls drained dry. Erich, meanwhile, marched with a column of men into a small town. Roofs had collapsed, cobblestone streets were pitted with craters, walls scarred with bullet holes. Smoke still rose from the carcasses of burned-out vehicles. In the square, hundreds of German soldiers stood in line, handing over their weapons to the Americans. Kar-98s, MG-42s, Panzerfausts piled in heaps. An American officer shouted in clumsy German, "Drop everything!" Hands up. Erich stood among them, his hands trembling as he raised them high. He felt as if he had just surrendered the last thing he had, the right to be called a soldier. Now he was only a prisoner, led away like a shadow. As they were marched out, he glanced back. The town lay in smoke, children crying mixed with the sound of nails being hammered into coffins. In his heart echoed a bitter question, was all the sacrifice for nothing? Jack, too, faced ashes, but in another form. That night he lay on a steel cot in the barracks, unable to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of Germans running in panic under Jug gunfire. Saw Jimmy Clark vanish into a fireball, saw the bridge splinter, dark figures tumbling into the river. He sat upright, drenched in sweat. In the silence of the camp, he heard his own heartbeat pounding like a drum. He whispered, "We won? But why does it feel like we lost so much?" A week later, Erich was marched to a prison camp on the outskirts. On the way, the prisoners passed an American convoy. Erich lifted his head and locked eyes with an American pilot sitting on the wing of a resting P-47. For an instant, their eyes met, one who had once mocked the Jug, one who had flown it as a hunter. No words were spoken, yet there was an uncanny understanding. Erich lowered his head and kept walking. Jack turned away, lit a cigarette, and drew in deeply, but the smoke couldn't mask the bitterness inside. That evening, Erich stood behind barbed wire, watching the sunset spread red across the sky. It reminded him of the flames of the Jug that had once ripped his homeland apart. He closed his eyes and sighed. Germany had died, along with every legend. Jack, in his barracks, watched the same sunset from the window. Its red hue made him shudder, too. To him, it was a reminder that this victory had been bought with countless drops of blood. Erich, the defeated, shuffled in line with the prisoners, carrying the bitterness of a nation that had lost everything. Jack, the victor, sat silent in his tent, carrying the torment of a survivor. Different uniforms, different flags, but the same loss of youth, of friends, of faith, stolen by war. The war ended in May 1945. The guns fell silent, but in Germany, smoke still rose from ruined cities. In prison camps, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers sat motionless, eyes vacant. On Allied airfields, rows of P-47 jugs stood, riddled with holes, engines dripping oil, yet towering still, monuments to the storm that had passed. Two men on opposite sides survived to see that day: Erich Brandt, a German prisoner of war, and Jack Reynolds, an American pilot. In the camp, Erich spent days lost in thought. He no longer felt like a pilot. The Luftwaffe's wings were broken. The Tiger legend burned to ash. The Germany he once believed in was rubble. But what haunted him most was the P-47. Every time he closed his eyes, he still heard its engines roar, still saw the jug diving, still smelled smoke and burning flesh. To him, the jug was more than just an airplane. It was the very symbol of collapse, the iron hammer that had crushed his nation's myths. He scribbled on a scrap of paper hidden in his shirt. "We once mocked it, called it a milk jug. But it crushed the Luftwaffe. It is death with steel wings. Jack's ending was different." When the war ended, he was cleared to return home to Ohio. On the day he left, he stood for a long time, staring at his jug one last time. Its skin was streaked with oil, riddled with bullet holes. The left wing bore a hole the size of a fist, yet the engine had roared on, carrying him home from dozens of missions. Jack placed his hand on the battered metal, a chill running through his fingers. Two feelings welled up inside him at once: gratitude for all the times the jug had saved his life, and guilt for all the death he had sown while flying it. The night before leaving his unit, Jack wrote in his journal, "The jug was the shield that brought me home, the only iron friend still beside me after so many brothers had fallen. But the jug was also a giant beast, and every time it roared, hundreds of lives below were crushed. Its legacy, for me, is both life and death, intertwined in every takeoff years past." Erich was released, living in a divided, impoverished Germany. He worked in a factory and rarely spoke of the past. But sometimes, when he heard the sound of aircraft engines overhead, he trembled. People said he was overly fearful, but in his memory, the jug had never disappeared. Jack lived in Ohio, working as a mechanic in an auto shop. He married and had children. Yet at night, in his sleep, he still saw the sky lit with fire, saw Jimmy Clark plunge into the earth, saw German convoys erupt in flame. He woke drenched in sweat, covering his face, weeping in silence. Two men, once on opposite sides, were bound by the same shadow of war. In 1965, 20 years after the war, an air show was held in Bonn, West Germany. On the tarmac stood a fully restored P-47, its polished silver wings gleaming in the sunlight. It was displayed as a symbol of American industrial might. Erich, now in his 40s, came with his son. He froze, his chest tightening at the sight of the jug. Memories came flooding back. Bombs, fire, the bodies of his friends. He wanted to turn away, but his legs would not move. Suddenly he heard an American voice behind him. A tall, broad-shouldered man, hair streaked with grey, stood only a few steps away. In his eyes burned a familiar weariness. Erich recognized it instantly, the look only men who had endured great sorrow carried. The American was Jack Reynolds, back in Europe on a visit. For a long moment the two men looked at each other. There was no hatred, no greeting, only silence, the silence of those who had survived the same storm. Evening fell. golden light spread across the airfield. The P-47 gleamed as if new, standing motionless like a monument. Children ran around it, laughing. Visitors smiled and chatted. But for Erich and Jack, it was no game. They stood together in silence, two strangers, once enemies, meeting again before the iron beast that had shaped their lives. The wind blew, snapping the flags of America and the new Germany above. In the twilight, the jug stood still, yet seemed to roar once more. And so the legacy of the flying milk jug lived not only in history books, but in the memories of those who had faced it. A legacy of fire, blood, life, and death, etched forever into the souls of both the defeated and the victorious.